What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Grizzly Bear Blues Live. I'm your host, Parker Fleming, recording this on Tuesday, April 4th, before the Memphis Grizzlies take on the Portland Trailblazers. We're not going to be talking about anything with that game, for one, because Portland's just tanking up a storm. I mean, their injury report was a tweet thread, so, hopefully the Grizzlies win there. Hopefully they can take advantage of some tanking for Wembanyama. But also, too, we want to talk about something pretty big. Everyone's debating about the awards this time of year. Obviously, the Grizzlies have no stake in the MVP race. But the Defensive Player of the Year debate, pretty hot, pretty tested. I wanted to get somebody on here to kind of bring some sense into maybe both sides of the equation here. Before I introduce, let me tell you can get in touch with the show and with the podcast. So GBB Live is the flagship Memphis Grizzlies podcast on Bluff City Media's Grizzly Bear Blues. You can find it alongside Starting Five, Core 4, Next Gen, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, Google, wherever. You can find the Grizzly Bear Blues podcast network there. And you can also find all of our written content, both free and insider content, over at bluffcitymedia.co. Once again, I'm your host, Parker Fleming, and with me I have an NBA writer for CBS Sports, James Herbert. James, how's it going, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. So I wanted, I could have gotten a Memphis person on here, but I mean, it just would have been like, oh yeah, Jaren Jackson Jr. is Defensive Player of the Year, yada, yada, whatever. But, I respect your work. You covered the NBA at large, and I wanted to get your insight on the Defensive Player of the Year race. And let's just start by this simple question. Who do you have as your Defensive Player of the Year at the moment?
Well, I actually do have Jaren Jackson Jr.
Okay, here we go.
As my Defensive Player of the Year. I do think it's close. I think there are other legitimate candidates. I think there are people making really passionate cases for guys like Brook Lopez. I think those two are basically even odds right now to win the thing. And I get it. I mean, Lopez has had the best defensive season of his career, which is kind of crazy just considering the stage of his career that he's in, the fact he came back from like a serious back injury last year, and the fact that the way the Bucks have played this year they've asked more of him, right? Like they are helping a little bit less off of other guys. They're asking him to defend more, just kind of defending pick and rolls 2-on-2, not being as willing as they were in the past to just kind of surrender open 3-pointers. So they're asking him to lock down the paint with a little less help from Giannis roaming around and everything. He's still doing that. Their other guys are not just like hugging shooters like on every possession as if they're Steph Curry. But when you compare the way the Bucks played in the past, like it is definitely different. So I think Brook has a strong narrative case for the thing. The stats are awesome for both players. For me, it's just kind of like you look at the overall amount of things that Jaren Jackson can do. You look at some of the stats that are unique to him, like his block percentage, which is historic. And just sort of the way that the Grizzlies can play because of the way that Jaren Jackson plays. That kind of sets him apart a little bit. Like Brook Lopez does not have nearly the same sort of defensive versatility as Jaren Jackson Jr. He's incredible at his job. Jackson's incredible at his job. I just think Jackson's job is like genuinely harder.
No, yeah, I totally get that. And it's ironic, and I think this is just kind of the Budenholz principles here. Taylor Jenkins uses Jaren Jackson Jr. like how the Bucks use Giannis. They have him guarding fours, and they have him coming over and helping on the weak side or helping whenever teams drive to the basket to help swat shots, use his length to alter shots, especially, too, having a guy like Brook Lopez who, don't get me wrong, he's a very elite defender, but you're asking a driver a lot of the times, usually someone about 6'7" or under, to finish over the trees of 2 7-footers. I mean, good luck. Like it's like kind of lights out at that point. That's what the Grizzlies are doing with Jaren Jackson Jr. and for the most part of this year, Steven Adams just force teams to try to finish over 2 7-footers, and both players are having great rim protection numbers as a result. But kind of the case that I kind of fall back on is something you said, like they're having him defend with more responsibilities in a sort because they're using him like Giannis. I was looking at something on NBA.com over some awards race predictions and such like that, and somebody pointed out how Jaren Jackson Jr. has spent like 20 to 30% of his possession. Yeah, 20% of his possessions guarding guards, and guards are only
Yeah.
shooting 36%
Yeah.
on Jaren Jackson Jr., which is nuts. Like when you think about it, this is a 7-footer who could just kind of move around the perimeter and really take the whole like. I know the switching thing has been a big phenomenon in modern NBA. Like what big men can switch onto guards. I mean, he takes that to an entirely new level with his
Mhm.
ability, not just like switch, but like hold his own like in like close situations, like a lot of situations where like I saw like players like Darius Garland, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, they're trying to ISO him up down the stretch and they can't. Like they can't do that
Yeah.
because of how quickly he can move side to side and stuff like that. So I mean, the responsibilities. And another thing I fall back on, and I know it was so early in the season, but before Jaren Jackson Jr. came back, they were like 19th or 20th
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
defensive rating. And then within like a month, they like skyrocketed up to like second behind Cleveland. And then during that span where Jackson was back, they had the best defensive rating by a mile. I just see him as the most transformative defender out on the floor this year. Do you kind of echo that same sentiment, or do you think a guy like Brooke or even somebody else kind of has that same defensive impact? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of echo your point on what he does as a roamer, my guy Jared Dubin had a piece in January on 538 that cited a stat from Second Spectrum where he was like first in points allowed, like fewest points allowed per possession as a help defender against a drive, which is a very specific stat, but it kind of is one of the ways that he is dominant, where he will just kind of appear out of nowhere and either reject a shot, which he's been better than anybody else in the NBA at doing that this year, or contest and change a shot. And I messaged Dubin earlier today. I checked with him like to ask, because I don't have Second Spectrum. Like, is he still first in that? And like, yeah, there's like 84 dudes who have defended 250 plus drives as a help defender, and Jaren's number one. And then after him, it's like Giannis, Claxton, actually Xavier Tillman, and then Bismack Biyombo, who has just been doing yeoman's work off the bench in Phoenix as this sort of almost like defense-only player there.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the guys I would compare Jaren to, like I would look at Evan Mobley in Cleveland, who plays a pretty similar role. Also will switch out onto guards, even stars on the perimeter, and he does his sort of help side stuff, protects the rim. Bam Adebayo has been sort of known as the premier switch big in the NBA for a few years. He has a sort of similar responsibility. And honestly, even like Draymond, like just the way he communicates switches, can play any sort of coverage, and can also be that backline defender just because of his length and his anticipation and all of that. Like those are kind of the guys, like in terms of stylistically, that I would compare to Jaren Jackson Jr. this year. I just think like Jackson has just been slightly better than than all of those guys in that role. And it's not like all these guys are all defense candidates, and like most of the guys I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned would be on my all defensive team if I were to make it right now. How you rank them, like that, like some people's tastes may vary. Like we talked about Lopez earlier. Like I don't really think Lopez could do his job any better than he's done it this year. He's been phenomenal. I just also know that Brooke could not do Jaren Jackson Jr.'s job. And I think if Jaren had to do
Right.
Brooks' job, he would mostly be able to do it. Like he's not as strong, so like against certain like post up guys, like I think Brooke Lopez would fare a little bit better just in terms of like strictly like in a deep drop. I think Lopez has mastered that in a way, but like Jaren Jackson is not like bad if you want to put him in a drop. It's just he's also so freaking
No.
mobile that by default the Grizzlies are going to want to have him defend pick and rolls more aggressively. And you see him like out at the level, like up to touch on a defender, and then just retreating back, like totally in control. There's no wasted motion. He's guarding two people at the same time. He's recovering. Like the amount of times he's guarded a pick and roll, and his like the screener has gotten the ball and thought he's had an open layup, and then Jaren just appears out of nowhere and rejects the shot. Like how many times do you watch that this year? Like that
Right.
happens all the time, and we're not even talking about the possessions when he is switched onto a smaller player and funneling him toward wherever Adams is or Tillman is, or just like straight up like standing him up defensively and getting a stop, or like then chasing that guy around. Like he kind of does everything. And that's what's so awesome. Like you can see him guarding like basically at any spot on the floor, whether he is providing like nail help, or whether he is roaming off of a guy in the corner, or whether he's just like matched up one on one with somebody. Like he's excellent at every part of it. The flaws are probably a little bit louder, just like because everybody likes to talk about the fouling and the minutes. And Brook Lopez doesn't have that problem, but like one of the reasons Brook Lopez doesn't have that problem is they're playing like a very conservative scheme where you are less likely to pick up the kind of fouls that Jaren does. So that in a way, it's kind of baked in not to totally let Jaren off the hook. Like some of these games, like the Grizzlies would definitely prefer to have him on the floor for 30, 35 plus minutes, and they just haven't had that luxury. But the minutes differential isn't so large to the point where I think it overcomes the rest of sort of Jaren's case as the number one defender in the NBA this year.
Right. And that's like kind of the thing that I kind of struggle with, where people are using the minutes played or the games played. I mean, I'm looking at his basketball reference page right now. I like if he plays the rest of the season, if there's no rest or anything for the Memphis Grizzlies, I want to say they have no. It'd be one game under the new requirement. He would be at 64 games this season.
Yeah.
Um, if he played the rest of the season. But I mean, it's one of those things. Like one, he was coming back from injury, where there's going to be an obvious minutes load. I mean, he had an all season foot injury. He was out really for like 4 months from that. So I mean, obviously they're not going to like come in and immediately play him 35 minutes. But also too, Taylor Jenkins has a very conservative rotation approach when it comes to his star players' minutes. Really, aside from who's Ja still, it's only like 33 minutes a night. Like it's not anything high or anything, but he tries to use the regular season, especially those times from October to probably February-ish, to play a 10-man rotation, sometimes 9, develop his
Yep.
guys, see who can, be the next man up, see what he can find from there. I mean, and with that, he's been able to turn David Roddy into a guy that may get playoff rotation minutes this year. Santi Aldama, who I wish he would have gotten to be a wild card this year, but I mean, with Brandon Clark's injury, he's now the third big off the bench, depending on
Mm-hmm.
whether Steven Adams gets back or not. And then that would shuffle Xavier Tillman over to the bench, and he would probably be in that role. But they have this methodical approach to ramp up players' minutes, and I mean it's paying off with Jackson thus far. I mean, since the All-Star break, they've been really utilizing him more, getting him closer to that 35-minute threshold. But
Yeah.
obviously, too, the one thing that sticks, the foul trouble. The foul trouble is one thing that kind of limits him in that. And really, it's because he tries to block absolutely everything. Like Jaren Jackson Jr. is and it also makes him so fun about a defender. 'Cause, I mean, you have a lot of these defenders, especially guys of like his caliber or whatever. They want to make business decisions. They don't want to get dunked on. Man, Jaren Jackson Jr. has gotten dunked on quite a bit this year, but also it's
Yeah.
totally worth it because he's averaging 3 blocks a game this year, and he's one of the best. He's probably the best shot blocker overall in the entire NBA. I mean, he's had that big block on John Collins that was challenged and overturned last week.
Mm-hmm.
That was nuts. He had that game-sealing block on Joel Embiid that was awesome as well. I mean, I don't know. I think you can't omit those when it comes to the discussion with Jaren Jackson Jr. because at the end of the day, the fouling is what is the most important element of his game because it can cost the Grizzlies a playoff game or two. But I don't think it's anything to give him too many demerits for when it comes to Defensive Player of the Year or anything.
It's just one of those things that is like easy to talk about, and when you're listing pros and cons, like everybody's gonna have that as a con. I remember I had a story like years ago. Jaren was probably in his second year or something, and Marc Gasol he was in Toronto, and I was talking to him about like the old like what the Grizzlies were doing now, like without him and Mike, and he was saying like, yeah, I still text Jaren like stop fouling so much, and like he doesn't foul as much as he did then. He fouls about the same amount as he did last year, which was like a big step forward on a per possession basis from before. But it's still an issue, and we can talk about that. But I mean, we could like Bam Adebayo hasn't had the strongest like finish to the season. I think he's had a bit of some slippage there, and the Heat have had some weird times lately. Brook Lopez has some holes in his defensive game. It's just the Bucks are constructed so that the team doesn't really feel it. Like he's got
Right.
Drew Holiday and Javon Carter defending virtually every pick and roll, the point of attack. He has Giannis roaming. So it's not really a problem that Brook is much more comfortable in a pretty deep drop. You see him sometimes getting out there higher. You've even seen occasionally over the years, not so much lately, but occasionally you see Bud will go to a switch lineup and even trust Brook there, and take his chances in that regard. But I mean, it's like the fact that Jaren can play literally any type of defensive coverage that you want is kind of a separator to me. And it's like, yeah, the foul thing is obvious, and he knows that. The team knows it, but to an extent, it's part and parcel with the way that he plays. They want him challenging every shot. They want him to serve as a deterrent on potential drives. They want guys to sort of think twice about going in there, knowing that Jaren is not like he's never going to make a business decision. Like you said, he's going to meet them there. He doesn't care if it's freaking Joel Embiid. He's going to put his body on the line. And we've seen these plays where like Jaren will like fall down and like recover and get up and make a second effort, to say nothing of like the normal like kind of second jump that you might see. Seen him block back-to-back shots on the same possession and things like that this year. He's just kind of everywhere. And that is kind of, I think, like sort of the model going forward, more than just the paint-bound rim protector. Not like the paint-bound rim protector can be really good, but you need kind of other pieces around them more so. Like, I think it's not that the Grizzlies have a bunch of horrible perimeter defenders or anything. I think Jaws got a little bit better in that regard this year. Dillon Brooks obviously isn't just, he's insane when it comes to getting around screens and like contesting from behind and just sticking to guys. Even like Jitty's good in that regard. Like they've got guys who can like do it, but it's not the same. Like it's not Drew Holiday and Javon Carter defending like at the point of attack every single time. And even their other guys, like a lot of the guys they've brought in over the years, it's like part of the reason they wanted Wesley Matthews is because of like what he can do like at the point of attack, like getting around screens and contesting from behind. Pat Connaughton is really good at that too. They just sort of built this whole system around playing a drop, and I think this year they tilted it even more to be like, all right, like we're gonna basically trust Brook to clean everything up and like trust everybody else to kind of do their job. And I think that's obviously worked out super well for Milwaukee, but I mean the stats are really close, and like the Grizzlies half court defense has actually been better full stop than Milwaukee's has, and with Jaren on the court, it's crazy. It's like 90 points per 100 possessions in the half court, which is like absolutely absurd, and like a lot of that
It's
is Jaren
suffocating.
doing heavy lifting himself. Like credit to like the communication, the team stuff, all of that. Like Tillman, Brooks, everything. There's a bunch of guys that are good defenders, but like Jaren is by far the best defender on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just saying too, there's a lot of stuff, like you said, there's a lot of stuff Jaren Jackson can do. And a lot of those roles that we're talking about with Brook Lopez, like playing the deep drop, protecting the rim, and being that deterrent. I mean, Jaren Jackson Jr. is doing that too. I know
Yeah.
where you see Jaren more in a drop is more when he's like sagging off on guys as part of the scheme. I think
Yeah.
one of the really cool things, if you look at if you go back and watch the New Year's Eve New Orleans Pelicans game and in the Black Friday New Orleans Pelicans game, I was really pumped. I'm like, yeah, they're gonna put Jaren on Zion. It's gonna be a really fun battle to watch. But what they did instead was they put Dillon Brooks on Zion at the point of attack, and it had Jaren Jackson Jr. guarding Herb Jones and
Yeah.
just completely helping off of him, not paying any attention whatsoever on the 3-point line. And then Steven Adams is on Jonas Valanciunas, who like he's not really a guy with any sort of shooting gravity or anything. So Brooks would funnel Zion to Jaren Jackson Jr. and Steven Adams, and they just force him into wildly inefficient nights. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at it today. His splits against Memphis this year in 2 games, he shot like 43% from the field, and he had averaged 5 turnovers a game against 2.5 assists.
Yeah.
And I think one of those games he had 9 turnovers. Like, it was something bonkers like that. But they also last week, I was kind of worried about the Zubac matchup a little bit because he's one of those centers, kind of like Jakob Poeltl, where it's like if you're small, they're gonna look like an All NBA center that night. And Xavier
Yeah.
Tillman, like stepping in the starting lineup, like he's been great. He's been a great defender, but he's still a 6'8" center without any vertical pop. So a center with size could exploit that. But they put Jaren Jackson Jr. on him and then Tillman on Kawhi, and they just had Jaren just like hovering around the paint,
Yeah.
even if Zubac got like those free throw line touches, like Jackson's there as a deterrent
He wouldn't
and
even be near
is
him. He,
having
he was like deep in the paint, like completely ignoring him,
yeah.
just like do whatever you want. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's done the Robert Williams III thing better than Williams did, and that was kind of
Right.
the case for, like, some people were saying last year, like, oh, like Time Lord's actually the best defender on their team. I don't know about Marcus Smart winning Defensive Player of the Year. Like, the defense really turned a corner when Udoka at the time decided, like, this is how we're gonna do things. We're gonna hide him on these wings who can't shoot or bigs who can't shoot or whatever, and he is going to just shut everything down in the paint. And but the cool thing about Jaren is like, yes, that like he does that against Dubats, and you've seen him do it against wings like Herb Jones or like even like Kuminga or like whoever. He'll just play
Mm-hmm.
off of them, and he'll do like the whether you want to say Time Lord, Giannis, whatever you want. He'll do it incredibly. But then also you see if he's against like a non-shooting big that's more of like a playmaker, if it's like a Draymond or something, like sometimes he's up and trying to like kind of mirror him and press him and like make it hard for him
Right.
to like do the facilitating stuff. It's like you can ask him to be like to just morph into anything, which is kind of like it's not as if he is always doing that. Like he can kind of do whatever you need him to do, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's yeah, and like even with that too, like if he's getting up on playmakers and he's, having to switch onto guards off of dribble handoffs or anything, he can hold his own. Like I've seen him do it against Zach LaVine. I've seen him do it against Jordan Poole.
Yeah.
And those are the moments where it's just like, yo, like Jaren Jackson Jr. is legitimately the best defending big man in the entire league. And that's not even trying to show any sort of bias or anything. Like Jaren Jackson Jr. is really kind of putting it all together. Yeah, the fouls and cleanup, but I just feel like this is the year he's putting it all together. And then he's also the only guy in the All-Star game who was really selected to the All-Star game for his defense. So I'm like, that should get like a little bit of points right there. It's like, okay, like, I mean, it kind of shows. I mean, he was technically the last pick by default in the All-Star game. No, I nobody's going to pick a defender for the All-Star game, but all joking aside, I mean, yeah, there's just too many metrics and stuff backing up. I mean, pulling a stat from one of our contributors of Bluff City Media, Sean Coleman. I mean, this year, there's only, if you look at the company with this, it's Jaren Jackson Jr. and Hall of Famers. Players has averaged 17.5 points, 3 blocks, and 1 steal per game. David Robinson and Hakeem Olajuwon each did it 8 times, which is just absolutely nuts. Patrick Ewing twice, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar twice, Bill Walton, and then Jaren Jackson Jr. this year. I just think the stuff that he's doing, it's pretty special. And, the sports books are catching on it. I mean, DraftKings has him as the favorite right now with minus odds. Looking at it, I want to say it's at minus 145 odds. Brooke Lopez is at plus 110. I mean, everyone else is at plus 5,000. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that it seems like voters are going to vote for Jaren Jackson Jr. or Brooke Lopez. I have seen a late surge here for Evan Mobley, which I wouldn't hate the Evan Mobley one. He does a lot of the stuff that Jaren Jackson Jr. has done. I mean, but at this point right now, Jaren Jackson Jr.'s done it better.
Yeah, I mean it's close. Like I think he's like Mobley's had an all defense season. He's a freak.
Mm-hmm.
He's insane. Doesn't like I think he's younger. He hasn't grown into his body quite yet the same way, but he's still like yeah, he's faring better than he did last year when he's the lone big in lineups without Jared Allen, and he can just again it's kind of like Jaren, like he can just do everything. Like he'll switch on to guys, he'll roam off of dudes, he'll like protect the paint, he'll like just whatever you kind of want. Like he has been awesome. Like he just kind of overwhelms people with how long he is. But Jaren, I mean, I remember like his rookie year, he was switching on to guys, and you're sort of looking at him and being like, wow, like this is kind of the future. Like he's shooting, he's making these threes, and he's switching on the perimeter.
Hmm.
And I think now it's like, yeah, like all of those tools and skills that we saw, they've just been like kind of refined, and he's at the point where you watch him, like the way he communicates on the backside, just the way that he moves, the way that he positions himself. It's like literally the way he's like positioning his body and leading guys and sticking with them. Like it's all just really fine tuned, and to the point where like like to me he's been like the best defender in the NBA this season. So I would give him the award, but like it's more like he's just kind of on, even if you don't agree with that, like you have to understand that he's on that level now. Like you can talk about him the same way you talk about Draymond, like an all-time great defender. Like you have to talk about him the same way you talk about Bam based on what he has done the last few years. Like Jaren is like a game-changing player on the defensive end. Not just because he happens to be like super mobile and long and he can cover a lot of ground, but because like he is like his anticipation is nuts. Like he's a smart defender too. He's just a really kind of just all around dominant defensive player. It's like the blocks are what's gonna like when you see he gets 7 or 8 blocks in a game or he has some highlight. Like that's what's gonna get your attention. That seems like every other night that one of those two things is happening. Is there's either some like one crazy block or just the number of them catches your eye. Like and that's awesome, but it's not like there were some years where it was like oh like OKC Serge Ibaka or whatever would like literally chase every block. Like DeAndre Jordan, I think became a better defensive player and a more solid one after he'd won Defensive Player of the Year. Where it was like when he won it, it was like he was just trying to block everything, and the block totals went down. But then
Yeah.
he was like a way better pick and roll defender. And it's like Jaren, like he does like try to block everything that is near him, but it is not selling out to the point where you're like he is just like kind of padding stats and going for blocks at the expense of the team. Like that's just not. I don't see him that way whatsoever.
Yeah, for sure. No, I don't really see him that way. Like, I mean, I did say earlier in the show he does try to block everything, but to a fault because of his fouls or sometimes getting dunked on. I mean, that's just part of the game. But I mean, it's also the thing that is so transformative too. Like when you're talking about how he's in company with guys like Draymond and guys like Bam, is he allows the Grizzlies to morph into any situation they need to. If they need
Yeah.
to go big, you put him with Steven Adams or Xavier Tillman, and where he's the four and just kind of roaming around the paint or having to, or like if he's with Tillman, he can switch on to a non-shooting big or a non-shooting wing and just kind of be that rim deterrent or whatever. And I'm really interested to see how they do this in the postseason now that they're not going to have Brandon Clark whatsoever because of his Achilles injury. But those lineups where it was Jaren at the 5 with a switchy 4 like Clark, like those lineups just absolutely wrecked on both sides of the
Mm-hmm.
floor because you have two big men that could switch. And I'm very interested to see what happens now with that because Santi Aldama still has a lot of room to grow when it comes to defending in space. Maybe they've slot Dylan Brooks at the 4 in those situations, but
Yeah,
then
you
you're
can do
kind of
that.
like, okay, all right, who do you put at the 3? Do you put Luke Kennard to where now you have a 1 through 3 of Ja, Bain, and Luke Kennard out there? Or do you have David Roddy out there who still has room to grow as a rookie? That's where it kind of gets interesting, but that's also, and it kind of goes back to like the amount of roles that Jaren Jackson Jr. can play, the amount of roles he can play while still maintaining an elite impact defensively is just what makes this Grizzlies team one of the best defensive teams in the league for quite now, like the past 2 seasons.
Yeah, I mean, I even think back to just the series against the Warriors last year, which like who knows the way that goes if the injury situation is different. But like the reason why we're even talking about that is the Grizzlies are not one of those teams that is thrown into confusion by the Warriors like off-ball movement and all of the kind of actions that they run that are different than most of the teams in the NBA. Like the Grizzlies are pretty solid generally, I think, in defending DHOs and defending just like movement shooters who are running around off of stagger screens and all that stuff. Like they can switch them, and if not, they can communicate, and they have guys that will fight over. And like part of it is like it's a lot simpler when you have those lineups that you're talking about. If it's BC and Jaren, or like if whoever, if it's Dylan at the four, like sometimes you just want to switch all of that, and then there's no advantage necessarily created if you trust your big guys to do that. But the key thing is like regardless of if they're switching or not, like they're kind of just like locked in on that end, and Jaren is like an absolutely huge part of that, and it makes them less vulnerable to that kind of thing than some other teams who might have the same or similar like defensive rating over the course of an 82 game season might be completely flummoxed by the Warriors offense and just the way that it operates. And I think the Grizzlies have always kind of like, obviously like the whole rivalry and everything, but I think part of it is like they go into those games super confident because like they're genuinely not scared of that kind of deal. They understand how fast those guys move and how coordinated they are and how kind of unpredictable and they are, and they feel like they're ready for it. And like you just, it's not the same if you have a big guy who just like is paint bound the entire time. Like you cannot defend all that stuff the same way.
Right. Absolutely. It kind of just points not to just like their personnel, but also it's just their game plan discipline. Like the game plan discipline that they have to, especially with a team like the Warriors who have a lot of movement, they have a lot of chaos, and you're also having to account for two of the greatest shooters of all time, as well as a guy like Poole that can create off the dribble and either get to the rim or hit step back threes. The amount of game plan discipline you have to kind of keep up with all that and maintain all that, especially with a young team, it's really good. But also too, it points back to like having a big man like Jaren Jackson Jr. that can account for all those different roles, whether that's guys like Draymond hitting Kuminga or Wiggins off cuts, or playing to the level of dribble handoffs to making sure that Steph, Clay, or Poole aren't getting any clean looks, perhaps off moving screens. But yeah, it's definitely like a testament to like Jaren Jackson Jr.'s defensive versatility, but also just the game plan discipline the Grizzlies have had defensively since Taylor Jenkins has taken over. But there's one thing I did want to ask you kind of before we closed here. And, it won't be a habit for GBB Live to talk trash on other players. I know last week we brought up Desmond Bane and Klay Thompson comparisons. And I want to say something about Brook Lopez Defensive Player of the Year candidacy that's being kind of overlooked right now. James, are we sure Brook Lopez is even the best defender on his own team? He has Giannis Antetokounmpo, who has won a Defensive Player of the Year. He was the first guy since Michael Jordan to have an MVP and Defensive Player of the Year award. He also has Drew Holiday, who is one of the best perimeter defenders in the entire NBA as well, defending at the point of attack and all that. Are we sure he's even the best defender on his own team?
I mean, you can't be sure. I don't, you can maybe, if somebody was like, I'm positive that Brook Lopez had the best defensive season of anyone on the Bucks, be like, fine, I guess. Like, it's sort of like the most impressive when you look at like what they asked of him this year and the kind of changes they made with their scheme. But in terms of like just night to night basis, when you watch the Bucks, like oftentimes the work Drew is doing is just completely insane. Like he's an unbelievable perimeter defender, and we've seen it at every level. We've seen it in all sorts of different matchups. We saw it in the finals. Giannis, I mean, you said it, like former defensive player of the year himself. He's a guy, he can play any coverage. He's like, they sometimes play him in drop a little more than I personally would, but like he's okay at it. Everything else he's amazing at, like up to the level of
Mm-hmm.
switching, just anything you kind of want him to do, he can do. And like what he's been best at over the years is kind of being the guy that is disrupting what the other team is doing by roaming off of his man, by putting out fires when an opponent kind of gets an advantage, and being able to recover because he's so like just crazy long and athletic that he can kind of do that kind of thing. And he makes highlight defensive plays like Jaren does. And like, I don't know, like to me, Giannis is a better defender than Brook Lopez. Drew versus Brook, I don't know. Like as a team defender, I guess Brook is better. As a one-on-one defender, like Drew might be the best guy in the NBA on the perimeter. Like you're really
Mhm.
talking about, um, you're talking about Marcus Smart, um, maybe Gary Payton the second, who plays like half the minutes. But to me, just you watch him and it's like I don't know how anyone even gets a shot off sometimes. But it's like a very small group of guys that can do what Drew Holiday does. Like Dylan is kind of like the Grizzlies version of that, and he has an all defense case himself. But I wouldn't even necessarily put Dylan on Drew's level as just like a point of attack guy. Like Drew he's nuts. So yeah, I mean that's part of the deal. Like Milwaukee has built a team where they've been really smart about it. Like pretty much everybody can shoot at least okay, and pretty much everybody can like function in this scheme that they have designed, which is drop heavy, not strictly that. But even somebody like Joe Ingles, who at like especially at his age now, he's not like the quickest dude laterally, but he's so smart.
Mhm.
He understands the angles. He is physical as hell, and like he's even a good like he has been better on defense than I expected coming off of that injury this year. But yeah, I mean at the top of the line, you're looking at Javon Carter, you're looking at Drew and Giannis, in addition to Brook kind of manning the paint, and it's just like a really strong defensive team, and they can have lineups out there that have no weak links at all. So it's just kind of a different defensive environment. That this is a long
Yeah.
answer to your question. Where I could have just said no, we're not sure, and I'd probably lean that no. I would say Giannis is the best defender on that team.
No, but you're also educating. You're also educating us on the differences in those defensive schemes, what the different responsibilities are. But yeah, I mean, you know, no slight at Brook, because I mean, let's be honest. I mean, last year he had that nasty back injury, especially at his age, and you're just thinking, man, he might be done. The Bucks
Yeah,
may need to start thinking about, do they want to have Giannis at the 5 or move Portis into the starting lineup? Do they need to go get a whole new big? But I mean, the fact that he's come back this season and has been as impactful as he is, putting together one of his best defensive seasons, while also like he hasn't been a slouch offensively either. He's been so good this year. I mean, also
no, he's
too,
been really good.
you're listing off all their defensive prowess on that team, and you're not even including like Chris Middleton in there. Like that Bucks team might be one of the best defensive teams we've seen in a minute from a personnel standpoint, with guys like Brook, Giannis, Drew Holiday, Javon Carter, former Grizzly, Chris Middleton, and then even they just put a fifth guy out there who can provide a little bit of floor spacing and just be. I don't want to use the word competent because they're NBA players today, but they can hold their own within the scheme well enough to where they won't get played off the floor really easily. Whether it's Wes Matthews, Pat Connaughton, Joe Ingles, Grayson Allen, like that is definitely the favorite to come out of the East and probably win it all. I mean, for this podcast specifically though, Jaren Jackson Jr. is Defensive Player of the Year. I think we built a really strong case here, James. I really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything else you want to add before we close the show here?
No, I mean I just say like it's different styles, right? Like you could if you're just
Yeah.
talking like Brook versus Jaren, it's like if I were to try to make the case for Brook, I'd be like, well, look at like defensive rebounding. Like the Bucks are like, I think they're second behind Boston, maybe, but they've just always been elite in that area. And Lopez might not have the best individual defensive rebounding numbers, but that's because he's like Steven Adams. He doesn't care who grabs it. He's just
Mm-hmm.
gonna box guys out and like they're gonna rebound everything when he's on the court. And the Grizzlies are like not elite in that area, but if I'm making that case, then like I could go and look at the other side of it as like forcing turnovers, like the way that the Grizzlies play. They're just like way more aggressive defensively, and they can afford to be. And a lot of that is because of Jaren Jackson Jr. So, like
Yeah.
I think like honestly more than like where we land on like who we're actually picking, like you and I happen to agree, like this conversation is really just about like you're looking at different like slightly different jobs that these like awesome big men defenders are doing, and then you're splitting hairs, and like
Yeah.
well, I don't want to be like crapping on like what Brook has done because he's been freaking awesome. Is him being freaking awesome might mean he's like second or third when I like submit my like picks for defensive player of the year, which mean nothing by the way because I don't have a vote. But Like I'm pretty much decided it's going to be Jaren number one, and like I think we kind of agree on why that is.
Yeah, for sure. And I do, before I close, I do want to point to like one of the things you said, that the Grizzlies are a little bit more aggressive because of Jaren Jackson Jr. And that's just not because of like the aggressiveness that I said earlier, where he just kind of goes for everything. But even a guy like Dylan Brooks had said, like, you can be a little bit more aggressive up at the point of attack, up around the perimeter, because you have a guy like Jaren Jackson Jr. ready to come off and help and protect the rim. I mean, and then also too, like when you had guys like Steven Adams and Brandon Clark there too, and Xavier Tillman here recently, like they have really stellar rim protection, and they have a really good scheme, aggressive scheme to kind of deflect those shots into the paint, but also maintain an aggressive scheme at the top of the perimeter to also potentially gamble and get transition offense ignited, which they've been one of the best transition offense teams in the
Oh
NBA over
yeah.
the past 2 seasons. But yeah, like it's all based off different schematics. But I mean, when it comes like just that role versatility, man, just Jaren Jackson Jr., he's done a really awesome job putting it together this season. It's really great to, even if he doesn't get Defensive Player of the Year, the fact that, he's in this conversation, he has that All-Star bid to his name. I want to say I saw his MVP straw vote last week that had Jaren Jackson Jr. getting a fifth place vote. I mean, I'm just glad he's getting his flowers for all this, man. Like, it's really
Yeah.
cool to see.
Yeah. No, I mean it rules. I mean we knew what he could be. I mean I just saw him. He was on the Tim McMahon pod talking about how he hates the word
Mm-hmm.
potential and all of that. It's like, yeah, like I get it. Like what he is right now is amazing, and he's taken these huge strides as an offensive player at the same time as he's probably gonna win or at least finish second. Like we'll see if he wins, but like he's in that mix for defensive player of the year. Like it's just been an awesome season, and
Mm-hmm.
I can remember at the beginning of the year people like wondering like, oh, like when's he gonna get back? I don't know. Like he might miss however long, and like it just seems so irrelevant now. Like he's been pretty much healthy since he's been back, and the Grizzlies have been the best defensive team in the league since he's been back, and that's been like the kind of you know defining element of their season. I think is like they've dealt with injuries to a bunch of guys, but they have like the defense has been like good enough for them to still be second best team in the West.
Absolutely. James, I really appreciate you coming on this week's GBB Live. Anything else you want to add? Anything else you want to plug in? Especially as we're getting to playoff time, man. You cover the NBA at large, so I know you're going to be cooking on some good stuff here over the next couple months.
I have a Grizzlies related feature that I won't spoil now, but it will be coming out shortly, and I'll hit you up when that comes out. But nothing to plug right just yet.
Okay, I'll be sure to plug that. We'll be sure to plug that. So, yeah, you can also find all of his work over at CBS Sports, and you can follow him on Twitter at Outside the NBA. You can follow me on Twitter at Plaka_Flocka, and make sure you become a Bluff City Media Insider today to get exclusive Memphis Grizzlies, Memphis Tigers, and all things Memphis sports content. And with that, we'll see you next week.